I read an extremely interesting article the other day, part of which describes a paradigm shift in the continual quest to understand whether unexplained aerial phenomena are simply classified craft running through the night sky or visitors from another world. In this article, they criticized a quote by Dr. Michio Kaku, calling it unscientific. The quote was, "The burden of proof has shifted. It used to be that the burden of proof was on the people who believed in UFOs. Now the burden of proof has shifted to the Pentagon, to the military. Now they have to prove that these aren't extraterrestrial." This quote was made in light of recent videos and testimony from US Navy pilots, which seem to show objects that are rapidly accelerating from Mach 5 to Mach 20 in seconds, accelerations that would probably crush a human's bones. They're also dropping tens of thousands of feet in seconds, and showing abilities to move without making sound. And did I mention they can travel underwater? To be candid, these videos are astounding, but in a time when we can doctor photos and videos of this nature in a matter of minutes if we're skilled, or go to Best Buy and purchase drones for a trivial amount of money, there will always be skeptics, of which I might be one. It's for these reasons that I find the historical, supposed alien visitations so compelling. Welcome to Before Roswell, a collection of close encounters from early America. Some make the assertion that the first accounts of unidentified objects in the sky and visitors from another world over the Americas began around the time that European settlers were establishing residence in New England, but that's not entirely the case. Many Native American groups actually believe in a race of being called the Star or Sky People, which indigenous groups herald not just as visitors from abroad, but rather their ancestors or even creators. For instance, the Hopi Nation holds the belief that they are related to the Pleiades constellation. The Cree, Zuni, and Lakota nations believe in some connection to the stars, with the Lakota in particular believing that this connection plays a part in their life cycle, with them both being born from a spirit that comes to Earth from the stars, and then returning back to the stars after they pass. The Lakota, for this reason, refer to the Big Dipper as something that directly translates to the Trail of Spirits. An example of this star connection is the Zuni creation story. This story involves the early tribe being depicted as living within the earth, in darkness, until a being beckoned them to rise to the surface of the planet. The tribe members made their way to the surface where the early tribe met something that translates approximately to the planet's caretaker, imploring them to be good stewards to the planet. The Zuni tribe is not alone in this creation story either. The Hopi and Pueblo, the tribe thought to be the precursor to the Zuni, share a very similar creation story. Now, this is a classic creation story that in my eyes tends to land on the spectrum of religion rather than alien visitation, but some modern individuals, both within and outside of the Zuni tribe, interpret this creation story as proof that sky people actually visited Earth and maybe modified or created humans. Some Zuni tribe members even go so far as to assert that this story makes Native Americans part alien. In addition to creation stories, there's also stories that individuals interpret as alien visitation rather than creation stories. For instance, there's a Lakota story about the formation of Devil's Tower National Monument in modern-day Wyoming. According to the story, this tower was formed when a being fell to Earth from the stars with her newborn baby and perished after colliding with the Earth, although the baby itself did end up surviving. These star beings were found by a group of young Lakota boys that brought the baby back to their tribe, where it was raised by the Lakota. Now, being from another part of the observable universe, they say that the child wasn't a typical human. The individual aged fast and was much stronger than the average Lakota youth. When old enough, the individual developed an interest in returning home to the other sky people and actually left the Lakota, though he expressed his gratitude to them for raising him. It's said that later down the line, some Lakota girls were out playing, and they were attacked by some bears. But suddenly, the sky person's voice bellowed out, telling them to stand on a mound of dirt, and causing this mound to rise up from the earth into the sky, rendering the bears unable to get to the girls before causing rocks to fall from the mound and onto the bears that were trying to climb and reach them. Now there's more than this, but I want to limit myself to describing compelling events as they were described by the natives, rather than describing the interpretations of native mythology by ancient astronaut theorists. Ultimately, the purpose of this section is to highlight that stories of phenomena that could be interpreted as alien visitation go much further back than when Westerners first came to the Americas, and that even if these stories are not true visitations and rather religious backstories, they may have at least contributed to folklore that informed visitation stories echoed by Westerners. Maybe this goes without saying, but it didn't take long for sensational events which provoke thought of visitors from another world to grace the eyes of Europeans visiting the Americas. In fact, during his famous 1492 voyage, Christopher Columbus himself reported an odd encounter at around 10 p.m. on October 11th. In the dead of night, Columbus saw a light glowing about the water, which in the Atlantic Ocean of 1492 was probably a bit of a sight. On the deck of the Santa Maria, Columbus saw this light to be far away, appearing and disappearing multiple times, as well as moving up and down. The light was seen about 4 hours before they made it to shore, and it's worth noting that Columbus's account wasn't of this light being some sort of foreign object or religious symbol, but rather a sign that land was nearby. Not to be a downer, but if a seasoned seaman who had never sailed in this portion of the world before and didn't know how far the Americas were from Europe interpreted this light first and foremost as a sign that his ship was nearing the shore, when it indeed was nearing the shore, I'm sort of inclined to believe that this sort of phenomenon is explainable as an optical illusion or optical phenomenon rather than a sighting of a being from another world. Regardless, some believe that this event was America's first explicit account of unidentified flying objects. Following this experience, events that could be interpreted as alien in nature appeared to be silent for about a century, but this all changed in the 1600s when John Winthrop reported an encounter that, if true, is more difficult to explain than that of Columbus. In 1639, John Winthrop, a Puritan and governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, recounted an unusual event that occurred. In this event, fellow Puritan James Everell and two others were rowing through swampland before entering the Charles River of Boston at night, when they saw a light in the sky that emitted flames. They claimed it was about 3 yards square, or about 9 by 9 feet. They watched this light for almost 3 hours, and they said that the light went back and forth between their location and Charlestown, Massachusetts, a 2-mile across area, before it finally faded away hours later. When it faded, the Puritan individuals found themselves about a mile away from where they thought they'd stopped to observe the light, and this movement placed them moving about a mile away against the tide, so they didn't really understand how they could have drifted. Now, at face value, this event is pretty compelling. It incorporates phenomena that are nearly ubiquitous across modern UFO encounters: time loss and seemingly unexplainable motions being made by airborne objects. Because of this, some modern UFO researchers interpret this event as America's first UFO sighting, and possibly even its first abduction. It's worth noting, though, that throughout the region, and in Boston specifically, there's a phenomenon where methane gas produced by the decomposition of organic matter can combust in the air, which creates a light a few hundred feet above ground. This event is commonly known colloquially as the ignition of swamp gas, because of its prevalence in swampy areas that foster decomposition. I've even actually personally witnessed this phenomenon in the Freetown State Forest of Massachusetts. This wouldn't necessarily explain the light darting across the sky, though, or the changes in position, or the time that seemingly passed between all of this occurring. But it's worth noting that under the right circumstances, the whole event could easily be explained by natural phenomena and a misunderstanding of the tides. This event wasn't alone, though. In January of 1944, multiple lights again rose above the Boston area, floating across the area at around 8 p.m. in the evening. During this event, there were even claims of a voice heard over the water by multiple people in both Boston and Dorchester, claiming someone was yelling, "Boy, boy, come away!" And some accounts claim that the light took the form of a human. In this particular account, rather than general confusion like in the event 5 years prior, Winthrop explained that it was an encounter with a ghost rather than aliens. A few months before this event, a ship had apparently exploded in the region, and the man responsible for the event never had his body recovered. Therefore, Winthrop thought that the man's body was possessed by the devil who caused this whole phenomenon, labeling it as a pseudo-religious event rather than an unexplainable event like the one prior. Now, with modern eyes, this explanation asserted by Winthrop is difficult to believe given, tragedies befall individuals across the United States on a daily basis. Yet, to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't usually observe flaming corpses barreling across the night sky, screaming their final words. Thus, while I certainly wouldn't entirely dismiss that something odd was going on in Boston in the night sky on this evening, I also wouldn't rule out that this event could be a misinterpretation of a meteor, swamp gas, or something else occurring in combination with some poorly interpreted rambling and yelling by locals. Regardless, though, these two events, occurring in 1639 and 1644, respectively, occupy a rare space, being among the only widely witnessed encounters of possible extraterrestrials to occur over the United States before the 1800s. Additionally, these events appear to have occurred in relative isolation in time, and this fact is important. Keep in mind, communication in the 1600s wasn't as it is today. Abstract, scarcely observed events that occurred hundreds or even tens of years prior were not so likely to be well documented enough as to prompt someone to interpret their own lights in the sky as an echo of the previously observed phenomenon. What I mean by this specifically is that I doubt John Winthrop had even heard of the most recently well-documented UFO sighting that we know about today, the 1561 celestial phenomenon that were observed over Nuremberg, then a city of the Holy Roman Empire. And thus the accounts that he shared are probably to be trusted, I guess more so than fabricated, and probably unprompted rather than interpreted as a falsification to match some prior narrative describing mysterious aerial phenomenon. Finally, I must submit that even through a modern lens, if these lights were traveling back and forth and were sustained for hours throughout the Boston area in 1639 and 1644, it would be difficult to label them as swamp gas. And thus, if we are to believe this detail, this case defies conventional explanation as well. Additionally, I should note that about 160 years later, and coincidentally about 160 miles away from Boston in Camden, Maine, a similar event to these occurred. In 1808, Cynthia Everett, a 24-year-old schoolteacher who kept a diary, noted in her journal that she saw a strange thing in the sky. First, she thought it was a meteor, but then she described that it, I quote, lowered toward the ground and kept on at an equal distance, sometimes ascending and sometimes descending. This story was observed by only this one individual, but historians and myself largely appear inclined to believe Miss Everett, given, again, the presence of lights in the sky that moved of their own volition was not a widespread notion that would offer anything but negative notoriety to a person of this time frame. Additionally, at this point, while speculation about extraterrestrial life was certainly alive and well, it was not yet what I'd consider a hot topic. Everett also never appeared to try to capitalize on the sighting, rather shutting the account quietly away in her diary for years to come. What she saw, I don't know. Perhaps the same natural phenomenon that was witnessed over Boston in the 1600s, but whatever it was, our only record of it is confined to a single paragraph of this woman's diary, and thus whatever it was is probably lost to time. After this, sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena got quiet for a while. The early 1800s were fairly uneventful from a UFO perspective, and this was despite the fact that westward expansion was forcing Americans and newly migrated Europeans into territories that were simultaneously harsh, sparsely populated by like-minded individuals, and foremost, unfamiliar. On one hand, you could take this to suggest that accounts of unidentified aerial activity were sparse overall during this period and over these new lands, though on the other hand, you could assume what is probably more likely, that the first folks to move west either did not have the resources to record their accounts, or that they didn't survive long enough to record or tell their tales in the first place. Additionally, one could assume that in the early 1800s, folks had their eyes in front of them rather than in the sky, as this time period included infamous events like the War of 1812, the First and Second Seminole Wars in 1816 and 1835, and various crimes against natives such as the Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears, not to mention the American Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865. This is all in addition to the fact that westward expansion was dangerous enough in its own right. Despite this, it was only a matter of time until a new, gripping, apparently otherworldly event would occur that would capture the attention of folks across America. In 1865, a trapper from the Rockies, James Lumley, told a story which set the eyes of the nation on Montana's Rocky Mountains, getting his story printed all over the eastern coast and Midwest. James was apparently, in September of 1865, trapping around what is modern-day Cadott Mountain Pass, when after the sun had set, he noted a bright light in the sky. I quote, "A luminous body in the heavens, which was moving with great rapidity in an easterly direction. This light was visible for seconds, and then he witnessed that it burst into multiple pieces in the air before he heard a loud explosion." Now, based on this description, one would be inclined to think that this was a meteor that fell through the atmosphere and hit the Earth, and the case would be easily solved. This would be perhaps if not for what James encountered the next day. James described that he found a long path, at least a few tens of feet in length. He followed this path, which he described as being surrounded by debris, until he found a large stone jammed into the side of a mountain. This description, following this, feels so eerily modern that it gives me a bit of a chill. But James described that this rock had multiple compartments that were carved with hieroglyphics, even suggesting that what he was witnessing could only be attributable to human beings, and that it was likely a craft piloted by humans. Before we get ahead of ourselves here, though, let's take a step back really quickly and ask what could have happened here. We just had a hunter tell a tale of a multi-compartment, hieroglyphic-inscribed meteor lodging itself into the walls of a mountainside. On one hand, based on separate eyewitness accounts of a meteor over Cadott Pass in 1865, I'm inclined to believe that James observed this bright light in the sky, and perhaps even felt the ground shudder as it hit the ground, but then may have concocted a tale surrounding the events. On the other hand, I'm perplexed that a man from the 1800s could describe something that would sound all too familiar on an episode of Ancient Aliens running on the History Channel in the 2010s. At least, I would be perplexed, if not for the fact that there was already some rampant speculation about the existence and lifestyle of aliens in the 1800s. For instance, in the 17 and 1800s, astronomer William Herschel and colleagues speculated that beings may be living on a hypothetical surface on the Sun, escaping the extreme conditions we witness from Earth. In 1835, the New York Sun newsprint reported that life was observed on the Moon, suggesting that a race of bat people were dwelling there. In 1864, astronomer Camille Flammarion even wrote a book where he speculated how alien life might look, dreaming up the plants and animals of other worlds. There's a lot more than this, but you get the picture. Folks were talking about life on other worlds, and in my eyes, it wouldn't have been too far-fetched for him to have heard some sort of amalgamation of tales by newspapers and maybe authors, and then gotten ahead of himself thinking that he'd provide some truth to their claims. Regardless, whether spurred by this tale or a product of the times, unidentified ships in the sky were about to become far more common. In 1896, for example, A rash of sightings of one or multiple airborne vehicles became apparent over the United States. Let's keep in mind this was 7 years before the Wright brothers successfully flew their Kitty Hawk just 120 feet at nearly 7 miles per hour over North Carolina, although folks had been flying and steering airships for nearly 50 years at this point and had been floating in hot air balloons for over a century. These existing craft, however, were rudimentary compared to the later models such as the Zeppelin. Take these facts as you will. This specific instance was observed by thousands of people and included nighttime sightings of lights in the sky, which, keep in mind, was more rare in the 1800s, as well as detailed accounts of airships floating above the surface but close enough that individuals could describe a human-like crew and a pilot. Sometimes they even stated that these people were powering the craft by riding on-board bicycles. Some accounts described that this airship would sometimes land and try to abduct people on the surface, such as an account from the Stockton, California Daily Mail newspaper. Other accounts describe an individual shrinking the craft to be small enough to fit into his pocket. There was even hearsay that this craft was heading to Cuba for the purposes of war. Let me be abundantly clear in this case. It makes no sense to me that if beings were able to travel across the solar system, why they'd be flying a precursor to a Zeppelin through the Earth's atmosphere, rather than blending in or using a more appropriate or efficient vessel. Additionally, with there being existing and functional airships built before this period, it makes far more sense that these accounts would have been of a real airship, full of real humans from the 1890s, rather than beings from another world. Perhaps, for these reasons, I'm not alone. It appears that journalists and scientists alike generally do not take this specific case very seriously, as at the time airships were a popular topic in science fiction too. So it makes sense that some folks would concoct stories of seeing them in the sky, especially as folklore surrounding these airships made its way across the country. Fitting into a similar mold is the 1897 Aurora, Texas UFO incident, which is often referred to as an airplane crash before airplanes were invented, or a lesser-known precursor to the Roswell incident. Simply put, it was reported by a writer for the Dallas Morning News, S.E. Hayden, that an unidentified flying object crashed into a windmill on a farm in Aurora, Texas. A judge, J.S. Proctor's property was the site for this crash, and the crash wreckage was disposed of in a nearby well, which was underneath the damaged windmill, and also disposed of inside of a grave where they put the pilot's body. J.S. Proctor, as well as an Army Signal Service officer, T.J. Weems from Fort Worth, Texas, reported the deceased pilot was, I quote, "not of this world," and they even called him a Martian. The story goes further though. Around 1935, the property where this wreckage was kept was purchased by a Mr. Brawley Oates, cool name, who fished the debris from the well so that he could use water from the well. And soon after he started drinking this water, he developed arthritis, and he actually blamed the wreckage for his arthritis. To this date, the Texas Historical Commission actually maintains a marker at the site that does document this whole saga of incidents. Now, this whole event is a little bit controversial, and this is owing in part to the subsequent investigations of the crash site. Frankly, you can't just expect to claim that there's an alien body buried in town and have those interested in alien visitation ignore it. And I understand that. For instance, a UFO-centered show, UFO Files, and an affiliated organization, MUFON, went searching for eyewitnesses to the crash and the airship, and they were actually able to find folks that corroborated these stories of a flying machine crashing in 1897. Subsequently, they managed to find a grave in town with markings appearing to depict a flying saucer. MUFON affiliates asked the town if they could exhume and test the grave, but as you would expect, the town denied them this privilege. Instead, they decided to metal detect it, and lo and behold, they indeed detected some metal. I should interject here that this should be no surprise because just consider the amount of metal parts on a casket. There's hinges, there's screws, and sometimes the caskets themselves are made of metal. Just consider that. Regardless, MUFON eventually came back a while after inquiring about exhuming the grave, and they claimed that the grave in question had disappeared, headstone and all, and they were no longer able to detect any metal under this site. If you are to believe this whole saga, this is actually a compelling conspiracy with the local and federal government perhaps working together to keep the whole saga under wraps. On the other hand, however, plenty of folks believe the whole saga was just a hoax in the first place. One notable individual in this camp is actually a resident of Aurora, Texas, Etta Peggs, who was living in the town when this event occurred. The individual claimed that the whole story was made up by the writer S.E. Hayden for publicity. You might be skeptical of this claim, but in my other videos covering less probable folklore than that of alien visitation, we've seen time and time again that news writers are willing to make up about anything, from winged dragons flying through the skies of Maryland to a frog person cult having a secretive meeting in the woods. Additionally, UFO hunters claimed to have excavated remains of a pump that could pump water from a well on the property using a windmill, but further examination shows that the system in question was clearly of modern, as in post-1940 origin, and wasn't designed to be used with a windmill, thus lending no credence to the idea that there was ever even actually a windmill on the property to crash into. Now, following this, there was again a gap of about 10 years this time, and then World War I appeared, and again put Americans' eyes on the Atlantic Ocean rather than in the skies, with the prospects of German U-boats in the waters around the country being far scarier than those of extraterrestrials looming in the sky. And then there was another quiet period with no notable and widely observed UFO encounters at all. That was until 1942. At this point, aircraft had become far more common, even on a commercial scale, adding to the amount of lights in the sky doing irregular things. Additionally, fear loomed over the people of America that those irregular lights may soon be crashing down upon them following December 7, 1941, when the Japanese military surprised American forces at the Pearl Harbor naval base in Hawaii. Needless to say, tensions were high, and those lights in the sky were far scarier than they used to be, which was perhaps the perfect environment for the confluence of confusion, fear, and imagination to fabricate an aerial battle with a seemingly insurmountable foe over the skies of Los Angeles. This came to be known as the Battle of Los Angeles. The Battle of Los Angeles is an event that is nearly ubiquitous with the UFO community, with one controversial photograph in particular being a common point of contention. But before we dive into possible conspiracies, let me construct the timeline and atmosphere of the event for you, so you can better understand possible explanations that otherwise might sound dismissive. Following Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines were abundant throughout the Pacific Ocean, and the sinking of ships in the sea became fairly commonplace, leaving the threat of Japanese invasion fresh in the minds of weary Americans. In addition to this, the threat of a Japanese attack on the West Coast cities was certainly not a fantasy. In fact, on February 23, 1942, just a single day before the Battle of Los Angeles, a Japanese submarine actually launched an attack at an oil field near Santa Barbara, proving to the American public that the Japanese were bold enough to attack the US mainland and leaving fresh fear in the minds of those who dwelled near major coastal cities in the US West Coast. This includes military personnel. There was additionally fear that this attack was simply just a diversion in anticipation of a larger attack, with the military going so far as to sound the alarm that they expected an attack in the following 10 hours. Now, these arbitrary 10 hours came and went, there was no incident, but regardless, tension did not subside. Thus, at 1:44 a.m. on February 25th, when 3 American radar stations observed an unidentified flying object in the sky heading towards LA, it was all hands on deck. As the target grew nearer, anti-aircraft artillery were readied for an air raid, and as the target was tracked to be within 5 kilometers of Los Angeles at around 2:30 a.m., the city was blacked out. Now, it's worth noting that shortly after this, as this object began to pass over LA, it faded from radar permanently, but this didn't stop artillery units from reporting visual confirmations of targets above them at 3:07 a.m. At this time, the order was given for artillery units to open fire on these various targets sighted above Los Angeles, which persisted until about 4 a.m. Now, in contrast to modern claims of aliens flying over LA on this night, it's worth noting that military personnel were identifying not flying saucers, but rather traditional 1940s aircraft and airships, in this incident, with some personnel failing to observe any aircraft in the first place. Additionally, even military officials disagreed on whether or not any aircraft had even been shot down, with no solid evidence of Japanese aircraft ever surfacing following this seemingly hallucinated bombardment. Regardless, with the power of hindsight, believers in visitors from another world could not help but speculate whether what was observed and attacked on that February evening in 1942 was one or multiple extraterrestrial crafts. This speculation was perhaps spurred on in 1945 when documents were declassified showing that the Army actually conducted an investigation into the events of the Battle of Los Angeles. In these documents, it was revealed that, at least in part, what we already thought was true remained true. The military personnel observed and heard what they thought to be airships, airplanes, and balloons. Additionally, Japanese involvement was ruled out, rather favoring the idea that these were domestic aircraft being observed, despite the fact that, again, no aircraft was ever shot down. This explanation didn't really satiate the appetites of the curious American public, though, and this allowed for room for imagination in the whole ordeal. In 1948, though, a few more answers came to us, with a new theory surfacing. A report was released by an academic, one Dr. William Goss, who, with access to military records, concluded that weather balloons were the most likely culprit of this event. This explanation is actually quite believable given accounts by multiple military personnel, such as that of Colonel Watson of the 203d CA, who at 3 a.m. declined to fire on the target he observed in the sky given he thought he observed a balloon, and he was aware that a meteorological laboratory did indeed send a balloon up earlier in the night. There's plenty of credence to this explanation, as there are records of multiple balloons being launched in the LA area and across the West Coast on this evening. Now, many believers in extraterrestrials contend that it would be outlandish that the Army could cause a fuss like this over something they should be quite familiar with, like a weather balloon. But given the tension following the attack just a day earlier, and the fact that in records the word balloon was often used to describe the presence of a zeppelin, it's easy to understand how the description of a balloon in the night sky could elicit such an aggressive reaction. Still, beyond all of this, it's worth questioning that if this was a balloon in the night sky, why the entire anti-aircraft arsenal of the LA area was unable to bring it to the ground. Further, there's the notorious photograph of the Battle of Los Angeles showing searchlights converged on what appears to be some sort of craft in the night sky. It's worth noting that there are various photos from this evening which depict next to nothing, and various versions of the most controversial photo with all but the original photograph of something being retouched in some way. Regardless, it's difficult to deny that in the most controversial photo, the spotlights of LA do indeed to be falling upon something in the night sky. Just what this something is, though, is still up for debate. If you can't tell, while the Battle of Los Angeles remains an extremely controversial event in UFO folklore, I'm not convinced by it, with the only solid evidence of craft in the night sky being eyewitness testimony and America's West Coast radar system of the 1940s, two things that are and were well known to be unreliable. Add in the fact that there was looming tension, and it's easy to see how a couple of instrumental errors could result in visions of craft that were never there in the first place in the night sky. All in all, this episode doesn't really convince me that Americans engaged in a fight with beings from another world on that night. I'm open to the possibility, of course, but this saga doesn't really do the job of convincing me of anything other than the inadequacy and disorganization of the military-industrial complex. This is a case that should remind you of the, quote, question everything. However, it's worth noting that this extends to both sides. Given the lackluster evidence available to average Americans regarding this episode, I don't think we should accept any current explanation of the events that took place on that night, and rather should admit that the truth of the Battle of Los Angeles is highly uncertain, and we can't rule out the theory that extraterrestrials flew over LA, but it just as well could have been balloons or domestic aircraft. Frankly, I'm not sure if anyone knows which was the case right now. Now, in the midst of all of this discussion of aliens flying over Los Angeles, occurred another notable event on the West Coast on June 21st of 1947, the Murray Island incident. On this day, Harold Dahl was near Washington's Murray Island, gathering logs with his son and his dog, when 6 donut-shaped objects flew overhead. One of these objects actually crashed nearby, and it harmed his son and actually killed the family dog, and Harold claimed to take pictures of the aircraft and debris, and he brought back his boss, one Fred Chrisman, to observe the debris. Dahl later reported that soon after this he was approached by individuals matching the modern-day description of Men in Black, who threatened him and told him not to talk about the incident further. Conveniently, this man in black also fogged over the photographs, making them unviewable and preventing Dahl from sharing this evidence with law enforcement. This is essentially Dahl's entire story. Further investigation of the incident was unconvincing to both fellow civilians who witnessed UFOs around the state and to the FBI, who interpreted the case as an unconvincing hoax. Admittedly, the FBI would, in theory, be in league with the Men in Black, so of course they would find it unconvincing, so I don't think that really counts for much. Personally, though, I'm inclined to believe with these separate parties, as having only a story and damaged photographs isn't necessarily a strong argument when trying to convince people of visitors from another world. But on the other hand, if Men in Black actually did this to Harold Dahl, I mean, they have certainly done a good job of making his story unconvincing, because a story on its own is just a story, and you could have made it up. Now, for those of you in the loop with UFO folklore in the United States, you know what comes next. In July of 1947, here we visit perhaps the most famous account of supposed alien visitation in history. But before we get there, let's take a quick step back and consider the current state of the world and of extraterrestrial folklore. Again, I'm open-minded to the idea of visitors from another world. Let's be clear, I am pretty much 100% certain aliens exist. The question is whether or not they have made it to Earth. But with extraordinary claims comes the burden of extraordinary evidence. And to this point, Occam's razor would suggest that with the evidence at hand, in each case we've detailed, natural or man-made phenomena are probably a more likely explanation than aliens. Beyond this, despite the fact that the Axis forces had been put to rest in 1945, we currently lived in a world where the lights in the sky could be your greatest fears come true, and that technology that would have seemed impossible just a few years prior could be used to blow your enemies up or maybe blow yourself up today. In short, the world was probably more open-minded to the idea that unfathomable and threatening technology was looming around every corner. And that leaves us where we are now in this story, with perhaps the most compelling incident of potential extraterrestrial visitation yet, and fairly convincing proof that someone, somewhere, was hiding a revelation of great importance from the American public. Let's touch on the most famous event possibly in the entirety of America's UFO folklore, Roswell, New Mexico. Let's start with some backstory here. In this mini-documentary, I'm covering only notable and semi-corroborated accounts of UFOs, and that's what's allowed me to skip from the Battle of Los Angeles to Murray Island to Roswell in the blink of an eye. But if we actually look at the number of documented accounts of unexplainable aerial phenomenon in 1947 alone, the number is well into the hundreds. It may not feel natural when you watch movies and TV from the time, since extraterrestrial visitors were still a bit of a taboo topic at the time. It's not really something you talk about with your coworkers per se, but these first-hand accounts were on the rise. With this in mind, think about the emotions that would run through your mind if you were to open up your local newspaper and read the headline, Roswell Army Airfield, or RAAF, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. This was the headline of the July 8, 1947 Roswell Daily Record. In this newsprint, the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced to the public that they'd taken a flying saucer into their possession. These events occurred following Mac Brazel, a rancher working at Foster Ranch, a ranch to the northwest of Roswell, notifying one Sheriff Wilcox that a UFO had crashed on the ranch on some date before June 14th, and that on July 4th he'd gone to retrieve some of the debris and he brought it to Sheriff Wilcox on the 7th of July. Following the sheriff receiving the debris, he contacted one Colonel Blanchard of the U.S. Air Force, who went through some bureaucratic hoops and ultimately tasked one Major Jesse Marcel with retrieving debris both from Mr. Brazel and the crash site. Following this, Major Marcel briefed his superior, who ultimately tasked one Lieutenant Walter Hote, a public information officer, to issue a press release on the matter. This press release was the notorious account that the military had a flying saucer in their possession, a quote that perhaps haunts the military personnel to this day. In this article, there were also corroborating witnesses to a flying disc in the area, one Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot, who observed the flying disc flying through the air from their porch in Roswell, and they estimated it to be traveling hundreds of miles per hour, emitting only a slight swishing noise. Further down in this article, a Major General Nathan F. Twining, chief of the RAAF, told the print that the flying saucer retrieved was not a direct result of any experiment by the armed services. They also recounted that the material was lightweight and small enough to fit inside of a car's trunk. Shortly after this newsprint and subsequent radio broadcast, though, on the same day, one General Ramey ordered the crash remains to be taken to him in Fort Worth for inspection. And shortly after, General Ramey, Colonel Thomas DuBose, and Weather Officer Irving Newton identified that the materials were a weather balloon, and they even made Major Marcel take photos posing with some of the debris in what is admittedly an awkward-looking set of photographs, and they even flat out stated that no metal parts or engine were recovered as part of the crash. The next day, July 9th, the Roswell newspaper ran a new headline stating, "Harassed rancher who located saucer is sorry he told about it." In this article, Brazel somewhat awkwardly changes his story, explicitly stating that the crash was simply, I quote, "a large area of bright wreckage made of rubber strips, tinfoil, and tough paper and sticks." With this explanation, the media frenzy surrounding the incident died down for about 30 years. It didn't help that across the country, a few hoax flying saucer crashes were being recreated by adventurous youth, further harming the credibility of the initial account at Roswell. This all took a turn, however, when Major Jesse Marcel of the Roswell incident was interviewed by a ufologist and nuclear physicist, Stanton Friedman. Marcel, you'll remember, was the one who collected debris from the ranch and transported it to General Ramey, and was involved in the notorious press conference where the weather balloon parts were laid out, and he had awkward photos taken of him for the world to see, and to prove that it was surely just a weather balloon. Succinctly, Marcel stated that the weather balloon story was totally a cover-up, and that the debris recovered on the Roswell ranch was indeed extraterrestrial. In this interview, he also talked about the debris in incredible ways. He said, I quote, "It felt like you had nothing in your hands. It wasn't any thicker than the tinfoil out of a pack of cigarettes. But the thing about it that got me is that you couldn't even bend it. You couldn't even dent it. Even a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. I knew that I had never seen anything like that before." And he also said, "It was not anything from this earth, that I'm quite sure of. Being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and air travel. This was nothing like that. It could not have been." It's also worth noting that while some publications which speak about the Roswell incident talk about the presence of bodies, Marcel denied this throughout his testimony. Following this, in 1991, Brigadier General Thomas DuBose corroborated Marcel's story of the weather balloon being a cover-up, also denying that there were any bodies, adding further credence to Marcel's testimonies. Additionally, Major Marcel's son, Jesse Marcel, MD, recounted to the press later in life that when he was 10, his father had shown him alien debris from the crash site, which included a, I quote, "small beam with purple-hued hieroglyphics on it." Quick aside, isn't this an eerie link back to what the Cadot Pass incident showed with hieroglyphics being observed inside of an asteroid? Regardless, Friedman interviewed a number of individuals involved in this whole series, including Marcel, of course, but also the sheriff, George Wilcox, the public information officer, Walter Hote, Mac Brazel, the rancher, and even higher-ups in the military, determining that everyone had been brazenly told that their personal accounts of the circumstances they witnessed were false, and they had been re-educated, so to speak, and thus he thought a massive cover-up had taken place. Now, after these accounts by Marcel and others involved in the Roswell incident, more people came forward claiming some connection with the Roswell incident, with one notable and often repeated tale being that in 1989, when mortician Glenn Dennis recounted a story he'd heard from a nurse who'd been part of an alien autopsy for the documentary Witness to Roswell: Unmasking the 60-Year Cover-Up. Although it's worth noting this claim has since been seen as dubious given the creators of the documentary found out that Dennis had provided them with a false name for the RAAF nurse that provided him the classified documents on this autopsy, with his only excuse being that he promised the nurse never to reveal her name. So I think that's fair, but take this for what you will. In the eyes of many, this made Dennis an unreliable witness for providing false information, although for others they think the false name is justifiable, and this falsehood is more than offset by Dennis recounting stories of alien encounters at Roswell before the base's alien-centric notoriety was in any way commonplace. Now, at this point, the whole Roswell incident sounds quite promising, but let's look where conspiracy theories fall through the cracks, even if a bit. To start, I find the competing accounts of whether or not there were alien bodies a bit concerning. Some witnesses say yes, others say no, but personally I'm inclined to believe the accounts of Marcel, the original individual tasked with retrieving the debris, who claimed there were none. Some folks try to reconcile that perhaps everyone was telling the truth, and some people were just confused by the suggestion that individuals may have been conflating alien bodies with those of some servicemen that perished in nearby military plane crashes between 1948 and 1950. In my eyes, I don't know how even the most fallible of minds could confuse alien bodies with those of human beings, but perhaps after what happens to a body in an aircraft accident, maybe it would be hard to tell the difference. Additionally, while not many folks contend that no crash occurred here at all, many suggest that the alien angle is all for profit, taking advantage of folks that are drawn to conspiracy. It is undeniable that the story of Roswell is certainly compelling from a monetary standpoint. I'm sure there's money to be tossed around, and a lot of people will tell a lie for the right price, especially one that, ultimately doesn't harm anybody. I mean, heck, I'm probably going to make a little bit of money off of this video too, so I should admit there's a reason I'm covering this topic and not another one, in addition to the fact that I find this topic compelling. But with all of this in mind, I hope you could follow this whole saga. Frankly, while there are a lot of moving parts in terms of the people involved, I appreciate this story over the others because of its simplicity. Everyone in the Roswell story acknowledges that something crashed in the desert, but just what that something was is unclear. It's very quality over quantity, in the words of author Carl Flock. As for where I stand on the Roswell incident, I'm a little less decided on this one. I certainly understand the argument against Roswell being a legitimate case of accidental alien visitation, but at the same time, something crashed. And it's clear that even the best explanations from the government left something to be desired given the astonishing initial accounts. Frankly, on one hand, I'm skeptical of the supposedly reasonable theory that this crashed ship was a downed classified American aircraft. If it was, it certainly didn't appear that the government had any interest in finding it, at least. On the other hand, I don't want to come out and say 100% aliens, because even by what I consider the most reliable first-hand account, there were no bodies, so how could we assume this wasn't just unbelievably robust foreign technology? Oddly, if not for the initial major swerve by the government on what this downed craft was, I'd even be inclined to believe that this was indeed a weather balloon. But as I'm sure they often tell themselves, their poor handling of the situation will make me forever a skeptic of their claims on this case. And one of the biggest factors in favor of my potential beliefs here, like for many, is the relative credibility of many of the witnesses compared to other cases we've covered on this list. So, here we are, at the end of the video. Now, if you've made it this far, you're probably wondering what I think about all of this. Frankly, I think I can echo the words of Lamino when he made a kind of similar video called The Unknowns, documenting strange, unsolved alien encounters, and my feelings are that I'm probably more conflicted than when I started researching for this video. On one hand, it seems like people have been observing extraordinary aerial phenomena since the dawn of time. And frankly, from a statistical point of view, if we are alive and we are in the universe, it's unlikely that we are the only things alive and in the universe. On the other hand, I have to empathize with the words of Neil deGrasse Tyson when he succinctly states his stance on UFOs by saying, "Call me when you have a dinner invitation from aliens." If aliens are here on this planet, and in abundant numbers, then why aren't we hearing from them? Perhaps we are, though, and they're only communicating with a small subset, perhaps our elected leaders. I can't help but speculate, frankly, that with all of the extraordinary events I've covered in my discussion of folklore, extraterrestrials, and haunted places on this YouTube channel, though, that if some of these incredible events are in fact true. Now, regardless of what you believe, tonight when you look up in the night sky, you're probably just going to see planets. Maybe some stars dancing. But in the off chance that you see something dancing around in the sky, or maybe even coming closer to you, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.